agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. Joining me today is political and policy analyst Kristen Matheny. Hey, Kristen.
Hey, Mike. How are you?
I am doing well today. How about you?
I'm good. Happy Saturday.
Yeah. So before we get started with everything we have to do today, I wanted to just give a big thank you to all of our new supporters. It was a record week for us, and we are very grateful to all of you. And as I announced last week, under our new format, we have one episode per week available to everyone, and that's what you're listening to right now. And we also have a second full-length episode each week, as well as completely ad-free shows exclusively for our Patreon supporters at the $5 or higher level. And then at $10 or more, you can join our Politics Guys Slack group, where you can sort of look behind the curtain, see how we put the show together, learn about what we're thinking about doing maybe in the future, and give us your input on all of that. Also, it's important to us that nobody be shut out because of financial issues. So if you want to hear that full-length midweek show, but you can't afford to become a supporter, just email me. I'm at mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get you all set up. But if you feel like what we do is valuable and you can't afford to support the show, all you have to do is go to patreon.com/politicsguys for more details and to sign up to become a monthly supporter. Thanks very much. Okay, and I think with that, we are ready to get to it, Kristen.
We are. I think we are. So the first story that we wanted to talk about are the pardons, Trump's pardons. And then we also wanted to get into a bigger discussion about pardons and the process of pardoning, some of the questions that have come up over the years, because certainly the issue of pardoning, this isn't anything new and exclusive to Trump. This is something that causes people on both sides to question the process every time it does come up under different presidents. So just to give you a bit of a recap, this past week, Trump granted clemency to 11 people. And clemency is kind of a blanket term for things like pardons, commutations of sentences, different ways to reduce sentencing. So I'm sure we'll get into that. But he granted clemency to 11 people. The recipients included a range of different people, from disgraced former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich, which is a name I never thought I'd say on this podcast again, but interesting there, and former New York City Police Commissioner Bernie Kerik, to different businessmen and women. And there were a few people convicted of lower level drug crimes whose sentences were commuted. As always, the president's pardons and these commutations of sentences have caused a great deal of attention. Many are questioning the ability of the president to pardon, just generally, the process, and whether presidential pardoning should still exist as a constitutionally granted plenary power. So, I guess we could probably address Trump's pardons in particular, and then maybe we could go into a broader discussion of that. What are your thoughts, Mike?
Well, I wish I could say it was surprising to me, but it's totally not. Donald Trump has demonstrated he has no problems using the power of his office in a more nakedly partisan way, or even I could call it personal way, than any of his predecessors who, certainly there have been political pardons in the past and plenty of them. But Donald Trump is unusual in at least a couple of respects. Number one, most presidents don't do their pardoning or exercise their clemency power so early in their administration. So in that way, you could maybe say, well, Donald Trump is being more honest about things, and I'm sure his supporters would say that. But on the other hand, if you take a look at who is getting clemency, these sort of political help my friends sort of thing, that's much more the rule than the exception for President Trump. And it was sort of the reverse with other presidents, where they would occasionally throw in a clemency for a political supporter or someone who they thought was on their side. But for the most part, that wasn't how the process worked. And Donald Trump is just turning this process, like so many other, on its head. And I think that's a big problem. So that's my initial thought about Donald Trump's exercise of his clemency power. What do you think?
So it's funny because I had the feeling that that I was going to have trouble finding out the true number of Donald Trump's pardons and commutations compared to other presidents, and I was right. And I'm not saying that there's lying going on in the reporting of these numbers, but I found it interesting that to be fair, every president takes a lot of heat for pardons, and I think that a lot of that, especially in recent years, has to do with the 24/7 news cycle. If you look back through history, especially in the 20th century, I think I found a really staggering number: 20,000 pardons and commutations. Um, have been given throughout the 20th century. That's a lot of presidential pardons and commutations. And with a few exceptions, the exceptions being George Washington, John Adams, and of course, Garfield and Harrison, who both died while they were in office, Trump has actually pardoned fewer people than any other president. Now, I think there are probably some pretty rational reasons for this. He hasn't served a full term yet. I think a lot of it has to do with the pressure from the 24/7 news cycle. I mean, as the 20th century has kind of gone on, presidents have pardoned fewer and fewer people. There have been fewer commutations. I think presidents have become more aware. You started to see this with George W. Bush and then Barack Obama. They're very aware of the backlash to these pardons. But the idea of political pardoning isn't anything new. I mean, the first person to really take a lot of heat for that was John F. Kennedy, when he disagreed with some of the laws that were being pushed through. And so he was using pardons as a way to get around the ramped up enforcement of drug laws during his term. And, I think to your point, I don't think there's any defense for Donald Trump looking at people favorably who like him. I think it's pretty brazen of him to pardon people who are outward supporters of him. I mean, Rod Blagojevich has now called himself a Trumpocrat. Did he call himself a Trumpocrat or a Trumpcrat or something? I mean, he does value loyalty, and this is not the first time we've talked about that. But I want to call attention to the fact that he did pardon some lower level drug offenders, and there was some buzz on Twitter that he wasn't pardoning people of color, but he did. Actually, 4 of the people he pardoned and granted commutations to were people of color. So I get your point. I get your point, but I think that we have to put it in the broader spectrum of history, and the fact that he, in this grand scheme of things, he hasn't actually pardoned that many people compared to other presidents.
Right. And now if we make that a comparison at this point in the term, it's a different story again, because mostly, and I would also say that if you take a look at the sort of type, I think it's much more important to look at who is being pardoned. Like, for instance, I believe Donald Trump at this point has pardoned, given the fact that, so many black males are in the criminal justice system, and so many, I think, have a strong case to be made for a commutation or something. I believe at this point, Donald Trump has pardoned 1 black male, and that's Jack Johnson, the boxer from early in the 20th century. And, that's a bit of a head scratcher for me, certainly. But more generally speaking, if we take a look at, Barack Obama issued a record number of pardons, I believe. But again, it's not the number, it's where they come from. He issued 212 pardons and 1,715 commutations. That's a lot. But those were mainly for nonviolent drug offenders. And see, that's the sort of thing where that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think the intent of the framers behind giving the president the pardon power was so that the president could step in, and when there was a clear miscarriage of justice, something that you would agree was a problem, whether you were a Democrat or a Republican or what have you, that the president could step in and right a very clear wrong. That's not what's going on here. And, once again, it makes me think that the framers set up the pardon power, which is essentially just about absolute, right? Because Article 2, Section 2 says he can pardon, give reprieves and pardons for anything except for impeachment. So, but I think the framers believed that the people running these institutions and the president, these would be reasonably ethical people who would generally abide by the unwritten rules and norms that, people in power have abided by. And that's not Donald Trump. And so this presents a problem when we have institutions, I think, based on an assumption that people will just not be so nakedly, I don't think corrupt is the right word, but certainly nakedly in it for themselves and to promote their own political interest. And I don't think maybe that's a failing of the framers, but I think the system has generally worked pretty well. And even though previous presidents have occasionally at the end stepped in to pardon a very questionable person, and here on the left, I think about Bill Clinton in what I feel is his
Patty Hearst.
What? No, not at all, Patty Hearst.
Okay.
No, his unconscionable pardon of Mark Rich, I would say, and that's an example of helping out a friend. So it does happen, but once again, Donald Trump takes it to a new level, and that is a big problem to me. Now, to me, the larger question, though, here is concerns our clemency system. Some people have said, does it make sense to have this in the Department of Justice, where it's been since 1865? And the argument, I guess, being that, well, these are the people who are convicting these folks of crimes, and should we therefore have them be in charge of recommending pardons, because won't they be inclined to not do that, or just wouldn't it make more sense to have that independent? And it seems like that's what the White House is saying they're trying to do, is set up a system outside of the Department of Justice. And I'm not necessarily against that. But it also seems to me that the president's system isn't so much to make sure that it's independent, but just so that he doesn't have to concern himself with that at all. And it can just be more nakedly partisan. So I've got my son-in-law working on it, apparently. Jared Kushner's the big guy in this. And, sometimes I hear people on Fox News, and that apparently is a big part of, celebrity. Kim Kardashian said I should pardon this woman. So, okay, that's no kind of process. That's no kind of procedure. That's the sort of ad hoc, what feels good to me at this moment sort of governance that we've seen from Donald Trump far too often in his presidency. So I think you can make a rational argument that certainly the Department of Justice's pardon attorney office is too small. There are something like 13,000 requests. And I believe when I checked, they have a pardon attorney, a deputy pardon attorney, and 4 staff attorneys, and a couple of clerical people, basically. So you can make an argument that staff needs to be much larger and maybe taken outside of the Department of Justice. But I would like to see something more along the lines of, say, the FEC, where, it's an independent board. A majority can't be of either political party, and you can have nominations by the president, Senate approval, that sort of thing. But you can't have those recommendations be binding because the Constitution clearly says that this is the presidential power. But still, that would, I think, at least address some of these concerns without making this just a completely nakedly partisan sort of thing. But, once again, I feel like we're just trying to, at least on the left, we're just trying to design around a man who nobody really expected, the sort of man who no one ever really expected to be president, a man who just seems to be, doesn't really care at all about norms of democracy and just about getting things done for himself and his supporters. And, that's a problem.
Well, while you were talking, I kept in my brain sort of pointing to things like the First Step Act and the Second Chances Initiative, which are both sort of these, I guess, pillars of Trumpian policy and things that he's touted. I mean, his Super Bowl ad for reelection touted the First Step Act, and it sort of goes along the same lines of what you're talking about. There's a more official legislative way to reduce recidivism, to give people who have been convicted, especially people that you were talking about, people who have been convicted of these lower level crimes, these nonviolent offenders, drug offenses, things like that, a second chance at life in general. And of course, the Second Chance Initiative would allow for them to become contributing members of society, to be hired, and to make that work for them once they left prison. So I guess I would point to that as something personally, just as a Trump supporter, but also as somebody who is not afraid to be critical of Trump. I personally think that the First Step Act and the Second Chance Initiative are both really, really important when we're having this conversation. This is an element that I feel like a lot of people on the left leave out when they point to the fact that Trump has pardoned these people who generally are supportive of him. They've donated to him. A lot of these people are philanthropists for conservative causes. And I think, I agree with you. I think that this is something that he's done. I think it's something that presidents have done, like you mentioned. But to sort of ignore the First Step Act and the Second Chance Initiative, I think is a little short-sighted, because I think these are really important pieces. I think the First Step Act is a really important piece of legislation. I think the Second Chance Initiative is critical to reducing recidivism and to improving the lives of the people that we're targeting. As for what you mentioned about possibly forming some sort of a board within the structure, and I guess sort of, or in this, let me ask you a question: are we second guessing what the framers? Because I think was it Hamilton who brought up the idea of pardoning? I think that was a Hamilton idea.
I
Am I?
I I, I, I
Sounds like
think
Hamilton.
I think you're right. I was going to say it sounds like him, but
Yeah.
I guess to me, if Donald Trump wanted to do something big and bold on this issue, he doesn't have to wait for Congress on this. He's not shy about using his executive authority when it comes to, of questionable constitutionality of reappropriating congressionally approved money. He could very easily set up a new office within the executive branch, and maybe they're doing that. We'll see how that plays out. Much bigger, with a lot more attorneys, and say, I'm going to do something. He would never use these words, but I'm going to do something much bigger than anything Barack Obama did. I'm going to really take a crack at this problem. And if he thinks that close to 2,000 commutations or clemency acts is something, wait till you see what I'm going to do. And if he really wanted to say especially to minority communities who, disproportionately are, in many cases, I would say unfairly, are in our criminal justice system, then that's when he could stop just talking the talk, and he could walk the walk and say, who's done more as president to get people unjustly convicted or for too long sentences for these nonviolent crimes? No one's done more for you than Donald J. Trump. And he's not doing that. And that tells me something about Donald J. Trump.
I don't know. Like you said, it remains to be seen if he'll do something like that. I think that I can't help but think, and again, I don't like conjecture and I don't like guessing at the future. But if he were to do something like that, there would be backlash. It just seems like I know people. Yeah, I think there would be backlash just because it's Trump and he's doing something outside the confines of what people who don't support him think he's supposed to do.
Oh, I see. You're saying backlash. I see. I think there would be, on the left, certainly plenty of people on the left are very much believe that there are a lot of minorities who are serving overly long sentences.
Oh, there
just
are.
Because, that seems to be, there's some bipartisan consensus. So there might be there would be pushback from the sort of people who Donald Trump could give away, free beer and ponies, and they would think he's awful. But that doesn't really, that's unimportant. To me, the fact of the matter is that Donald Trump could do something today that could make a significant difference in the lives of thousands of people right now, people who he says he cares about. And instead, he decides that, well, I'll pardon people I'll give clemency to people like Joe Arpaio and Rod Blagojevich and these sort of people. And to me, that's just sad and really kind of deeply disappointing.
Okay. I guess we agree on some things and we disagree on some things. I think the people he did pardon, just, I wrote all the names down here and I'm looking at the list. These are people who wouldn't be affected by, or I guess I should say most of them would not be affected by the First Step Act. But I would urge people to, maybe this is something that we need to push President Trump to do as Republicans and as his supporters, to ramp up efforts to, grant clemency to people who are serving these long sentences, these awful minimum mandatories we always talk about on the right, and even some people on the left. I think there's a lot of bipartisan support to do away with a lot of minimum mandatories. And, I think it's something that we should look at very critically. But I would urge people to look at the First Step Act and to consider it as something as a start. I mean, it really is a start. Those communities you mentioned are very disproportionately affected, and people, thousands of people. My husband's a defense attorney, and he's defended many of these people who are serving these ridiculous sentences because of these archaic minimum mandatory laws. They're serving these disproportionate sentences, third strike and whatnot, for these nonviolent offenses. A lot of them are drug offenses. Alice Johnson comes to mind. Crystal Munoz, whose sentence was commuted, comes to mind. But they're not the only ones. There are thousands of these people, and this is something we need to look at and examine just as a society.
Yeah, and not just as a society, but again, the president could do this in a Trumpian way. It could be a big, beautiful wall of pardons and clemencies just from sea to shining sea. And I would love to see it, for one. And if President Trump did that, I would be the first one to say, good for you, Donald J. Trump. I'm using his middle initial
I'll hold
today.
you to
a lot.
it.
I don't know why. Anyway, but hey, I know we got more to talk about. But
We do.
before we do move on, we'd like to thank our sponsor for today, and that's Empower. Pretty much everyone could use some extra money, and Empower can help you save a lot more money than you might have thought possible. Here's how it works. You just put in your weekly savings target, and then Empower studies your income and your spending, and then automatically moves the right amount of money into your savings account, where you're going to be less likely to spend it. Empower also has budgeting for people who hate budgeting, and gives you reports with actionable spending insights and personally tailored smart savings recommendations. Empower can even negotiate on your behalf to lower your bills. They also give you real live person coaching for any financial questions you might have, and high interest FDIC insured checking with no minimums. So if you want to save big this year, download Empower. That's EMPOWER in the App Store or Play Store. I did, and over 650,000 other people have too. And Politics Guys listeners, you get $5 when you use offer code PoliticsGuys and reach your savings goal. Visit empower.me/politicsguys for more details. Okay, so what do we have next, Kristen?
Next up, all right. Yay, we're going to talk about the debate. Yeah, I know. Everybody is probably there. We probably have people who are shouting hooray and people who are groaning because, I guess the debate fatigue is starting to set in, but I still find it interesting. So we had this past Thursday, actually, Thursday night, there were 6 Democratic presidential candidates that took the stage in Nevada to duke it out. And this is, of course, just days before the Nevada caucus. So, of course, we're following these races very closely. And these 6 candidates definitely did duke it out. It definitely was a bit of a grudge match. And there was a lot of there were many pundits on both sides who had a lot to say about it. But, of course, this is where you'll get the exclusive Politics Guys opinions about what happened. So we had Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Bernie Sanders, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, former Vice President Joe Biden, Senator Amy Klobuchar, and former Mayor Mike Bloomberg, who took the stage. And this was Bloomberg's first appearance. So again, without getting into too much detail, it was just sort of generally accepted that things got a bit chaotic at points, which isn't unusual for a debate like this, especially as we get closer to the election. And they definitely went for each other's jugulars. So, like I said, this is where you'll get the exclusive Politics Guys take. I don't know, what were as a Democrat, what were your takeaways, Mike? I had some thoughts, but I wanted to hear your thoughts first.
I never thought I would say or start off a sentence with poor Mike Bloomberg, but no, I mean, clearly he was a rookie at this and not comfortable, and it definitely, especially on the non-disclosure question sort of fiasco, where he just sort of tried to brazen it out, basically. And now I should point out that I think it was just yesterday he issued a statement saying that if in 3 of the cases where there are NDAs, he would allow, if people wanted to be released from them, they should contact his organization, and they would do that. And of course, the other candidate saying, well, that's just not enough, because basically the only thing that would be enough for, say, any of them really would be if Mike Bloomberg just said, oh my God, I am so wrong. I'm getting out of the race and donating all of my money to your campaign. I think that would be enough, but just barely, essentially. That's just, how it goes. But, on a more kind of public policy level, he took a lot of heat for stop and frisk, and he wasn't honest about that. He said it declined a whole lot by the end of his term. Yes, that's true, but because of a court order, he's apologized for it, said it was a mistake. Now, maybe he means that, or maybe he's just saying that now that he, wants to be president of the United States. I don't know, but more generally, he just, seemed very uncomfortable in the position, sort of, a bit not so much dismissive, but you could tell he wasn't used to being in that sort of a forum with just, the riffraff sort of challenging him and so forth. And I imagine that would be kind of a shock to him. And, I thought to myself, Mike Bloomberg, it seems to me, he has been a Republican. So some people say, well, he's not really a Democrat. Well, I thought, well, he's definitely a technocrat, right? He's such a data-driven guy. And maybe he's an autocrat too. I don't know. But he does hold to a lot of very important values to people on the left. And he not only holds to these values, but he has spent millions and millions of dollars supporting these values and these candidates. And I think it's fair to say that financially, no one has been a bigger friend to liberal values in the Democratic Party in the last 4 years or so than Mike Bloomberg. And maybe that's with an end in mind, certainly. But hey, we'll take all the help we can get, certainly. But more generally, there's been a lot of this who won, who lost the debate, that sort of thing, the personalities. To me, I don't know that political science research says that debates tend not to change things a whole lot because, for the most part, not a lot of people watch, especially the primary debates, and most people have their minds made up anyway. And so, I like Pete Buttigieg, and I thought he seemed like the most sort of cool, calm, and collected person there. But of course, I would think that, right? But more generally here, I wanted to sort of pull back from, the kind of standard pundit kind of stuff and ask people a broader question, maybe a deeper question. And that is, what should you reasonably look for in a presidential candidate? Because now that it's down to 6, I'm thinking a lot about this because now I know, Kristen, you have your person, but for me, there are 6 viable people, and I need to make a decision. And I've said I like one or the other, but I wanted to approach this sort of systematically. And so I thought, well, what's most important, what's least important, and how do I weigh these things? And how could this maybe help out other people who also are not decided yet? So I was hoping I could kind of go through that, and you could maybe tell me what you think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
let's go for it. I'd love to hear your points on this.
Okay, so most important in one sense is the first thing I thought of was the ability to win. And because
electability is key.
I may have a lot of great ideas. I think I do. I think absolutely I'm a good big picture guy. I think, you could think that your barber has a lot of great ideas, but do you want to put your time and effort and focus on someone who doesn't have a realistic shot? Now, what does that mean? Who the hell really knows? Donald Trump, I would have said, in 2015 wasn't electable. And so a lot of people said that. And so I think you can make a case that all of these candidates are electable, right? Bernie Sanders is maybe the toughest case, I would say, but certainly you can't say for any of them, oh, no, this would never happen, right? Now, of the 6 remaining candidates, I think probably the case for the least viable, I would say that would be Elizabeth Warren. And that's just because I eliminate her from my consideration because it seems to me that she and Bernie Sanders are very similar. Bernie Sanders has essentially all the energy on that progressive wing. And so I just don't really see a viable path to Elizabeth Warren getting the nomination. So I'm just going to put her aside right there, Okay. But so there's that. And I say, okay, they're all sort of electable. Maybe not Warren so much because I don't think she's going to get the nomination. Number 2, but wait, before we get to number 2, Kristen, maybe I'm wrong about this. And I think, okay,
No,
let me just say,
you're not.
Here's what I mean. Well, here's what I mean. In a larger sense, maybe I am. Because, Bernie wasn't wasn't seen as being electable in 2016, and he lost the nomination to Hillary Clinton. But maybe that's what laid the groundwork, and you could make a case that is what laid the groundwork for Bernie 2020. And if in January 2021 Bernie Sanders is president, well, maybe there's a case to be made for supporting someone who's not electable right now, but who embodies the sort of ideals that might make him or her or a future candidate electable. And I'm thinking of, for instance, historical precedents like Ronald Reagan ran for president in 1976, and he didn't defeat Gerald Ford in the primaries, but of course he did become president in 1980, and in the Reagan Revolution and all that. And before that, there was Barry Goldwater, who was nominated in 64, got totally wiped out by Johnson, but a lot of conservatives would say that laid the groundwork for the conservative revolution. So you can make a case, I think, that even if your candidate isn't electable, you say, well, sure, he or she might not win in the short term, but maybe it's more important to take a loss, stick with my principles, and build on that. Now, I would say, given how atrocious of a president Donald Trump is, that's a pretty risky proposition, but okay, it's not an unreasonable argument. So that's what I wanted to say about maybe I'm wrong in a sense on electability. Does that make sense?
It does. But, the thing is that when we say that electability is important, we're not saying that it's necessarily the thing that we think it's most important. It just is. It's sort of a political fact that electability and likability, which sort of goes along the same lines, are both important. That person is liked by their constituents and by independents who might be persuaded to vote for them, but also there's that electability factor. And when you talked about Elizabeth Warren, and I don't know if you're going to discuss likability separately, I'm not sure, but one of the things that strikes me and I think it strikes a lot of people on the right. If I sort of remove my Republican hat for just a second and I step out of, the Trump zone, the GOP zone, when I look at Bernie Sanders and I look at Elizabeth Warren, I mean, I told you on this podcast like maybe a year ago or 9 or 10 months ago that Bernie Sanders was the one I was most afraid of, not because I thought he was most electable. I personally don't think he is electable right now, which is what you just said, but. The thing that strikes me as different between Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders is that Bernie Sanders comes across as genuine, which is, this is something he's dedicated his life to these beliefs, for better or for worse. I say for worse, I'm not a democratic socialist, but Warren sort of echoes a lot of these same viewpoints, but she's seen as a lot less genuine, and she's arguably a lot less likable, and so therefore she's less electable. And so I too would push her aside. But I think when it comes to something like Bernie Sanders, I mean, in a lot of ways, his a Bernie Sanders candidacy is totally unprecedented. We've never had somebody rise through the ranks who was a democratic socialist before, which is where I think the issue of his electability comes into play. But in terms of just like energy, enthusiasm, it's behind Bernie, and that is why I was far more fearful of him in 2016 than of Hillary Clinton, even though I knew Clinton would get the nomination because of the superdelegates and everything else going on. I agree with you to a greater extent, and I also would push Warren to the side. I don't think she's going to get the nomination, and I think we both agree on why.
Yeah, definitely. So after that, I mean, whether or not you think it's the most important, I would say clearly the next thing is in choosing a candidate is policy agreement, right? Obviously you want, and we don't even have to, talk about that. That just is pretty straightforward. And
that's what we do.
Yeah. But after that, then, because pretty much essentially if policy agreement is your thing, then you have your Warren Sanders, and then you have the other four who are, pretty darn similar, honestly. So,
yeah.
And that's me, because basically I'm in that center left camp. And so what does that mean for me? Well, that goes to the third thing, and that's experience or record. And for me, ideally, you want somebody who has both executive and legislative experience at a very high level, and who's had a lot of responsibilities there. And right away, one person stands out, and that's Joe Biden, of course. I think nobody in the field has a better understanding of what the job of president is like than Joe Biden because of his proximity to, an actual president for 8 years. And also, of course, Joe Biden has been in the Senate for, I don't know, since shortly after Reconstruction or something like that. So it's been a while, right? But of course, the problem with Joe Biden is, we'll get to that. Actually, it's another one of my things. But there's Joe Biden. Then I think after that, then there's Mike Bloomberg. You could say, well, he was just the mayor, but
it's New York City.
He's a mayor of New York City. And when you think about that, New York City's budget is larger than the budgets of more than 40 states.
Yeah.
Its economy is the size of South Korea's. I mean, so
it's wild.
This is enormous. So nobody on that stage, I don't think, has anywhere close to the sort of high level executive experience that Mike Bloomberg does. It's not even close, and then you have I guess you have Sanders, who's, he was mayor of Burlington, so, back in the day. But, so there's not a whole lot of that there. But that, to me, isn't necessarily a disqualifier because, Barack Obama didn't have a lot of experience. And as far as I'm concerned, Barack Obama has been the best president of my lifetime. You can cringe there. I know you want to, Kristen.
I did, but it's okay. I still like you, Mike.
Thank you. But to me, that then goes into what I would call personality and character. And one of the big things that I look for here is what I guess I would call a certain open-mindedness and intellectual humility. A willingness to admit that you, even privately, that you don't know everything and that you can learn things from people who are different than you are. That's one of the things I really admired about, for instance, former Justice Antonin Scalia. He made a practice of always hiring one liberal on his staff of clerks, so he could have somebody who would put good arguments against what he would necessarily think. And I think that's incredibly important. And that's exactly what Donald Trump does not do. And I think you need that in a president because it's a tough job and no one comes in prepared for that job, I don't think. And so the ability to learn and be flexible, and open to things, I think that's hugely, hugely important. And other traits that go along with that, I think honesty, transparency, treating people well is a good thing. And so that to me is incredibly important. And I don't know how well Mike Bloomberg does on that. If I had to rank the candidates on that, to me, even though he doesn't have much experience, Pete Buttigieg seems to me to be tops in that category. Then maybe Joe Biden, Klobuchar, Bloomberg, Sanders, Warren, kind of at the end. I don't know, but you would agree that that's important, right?
I think it's important. I don't know that it's one of the first things. I think it's important. I do love the idea, though, when you were talking about hiring Justice Scalia hiring a liberal to sort of help him craft his arguments and to give some weight to whatever it was that he was deciding. That's a very Abraham Lincoln. That's sort of a page right out of Abraham Lincoln's book. The idea of like a team of
rivals.
A team of rivals, which was a fantastic book, by the way. But
yes, it was.
It was amazing. But I think that's important. It's something that I've actually talked to many people. I don't know if I've mentioned on the show, but that's one of my bigger criticisms of Trump, and it's something I've always felt was lacking, was this idea of like reaching across the aisle. I mean, he's done it before, but it's sort of begrudgingly, kind of like you're a parent leading a kid, so
Sure.
sort of like pulling them across. But the idea of having people, surrounding yourself with people who are just smarter than you and have more expertise than you in certain areas, even if they aren't part of the same political party as you, is very, very important. And it's something that I personally wish he did more of. And I think it's important moving forward, especially with this divisive, climate we're dealing with now. I think that in the future, that would be something very, very important for a different presidential candidate to really talk about. And when you talk about Mike Bloomberg, no, it's not something that Mike Bloomberg has a fantastic record of doing.
Yeah. To me, on that trait, like I said, it seems to me just so clear that Pete Buttigieg is just far and away the strongest one on that, for me, at least. Some people maybe could make that case for Bernie Sanders. I guess they would, but that's more an authenticity thing. And I'm talking more about an openness. And I don't get the sense that Bernie is necessarily a very open guy. He's certainly committed, but not necessarily open to other things. And I think that was part of the back and forth between Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders on the stage in Nevada.
What about Joe Biden to that sense? Did you mention Joe Biden?
Yeah, Joe Biden's a weird guy.
I know.
In so many ways, because I get the sense that Joe Biden's identity is so bound up in being a politician.
Yes.
I don't even know that there is a Joe Biden as like a human being. I mean, his whole life has been running for office, in office. And so so I don't know. I don't know, really. I would probably put him right behind Buttigieg, but I don't know. But here's the last thing, and this is, I think, doesn't get talked about a lot, is physical fitness. The presidency is an incredibly physically and emotionally stressful, demanding job. And when I think that we have, on the Democratic side, 3 people in their late 70s who are running. Bloomberg's 78, Sanders is 78, Biden is 77. Warren's practically a spring chicken at 70, running for the job. My God.
Bloomberg 78.
78. Yep.
He looks really good for 78.
Well, he's getting 78? Injected with, I don't know, sheep embryos or something somewhere in Switzerland. I don't know, but anyway. Right. but yeah. So that concerns me. It concerns me the most with Joe Biden, because Joe Biden clearly seems to have slipped the most. Bloomberg and Sanders, I mean, they were on the stage talking about their stents. Well, Bloomberg didn't want to, but Sanders brought it up.
It's an important question.
Yeah, it is an important question. And then you have, Buttigieg, who's in his 30s, and Klobuchar's in her 50s. And honestly, that makes me a lot more comfortable given how stressful a job is. And I think, for any of those 3, before the end of their first term, they would be in their 80s. And I know a lot of people, and I know some people. I know enough people in their 80s, and I know what tends to happen. And the idea that you can't say that you haven't lost at least a few steps by then, I don't care who you are. I just don't buy that, and that's a big concern. So those are my lists of things that I think are important. And when I put all those together, it just makes me sad. There's nobody who I could just say, yeah, that's the guy. That was Cory Booker was my guy, and he's gone.
I know.
And so I'm stuck. And I think, my God, if only Pete had a little more experience, I would be such an enthusiastic supporter, but he doesn't. And so I don't know. It's not an ideal group, I would say, for sure. And I get a lot of our listeners are, our millennials or even some Gen Zers, and you see all these just boomers hanging on to power. I mean, not Bernie, because Bernie has that unique connection. And I get the whole okay boomer thing. I'm with you on that hashtag in a big way. But so yeah, it's certainly frustrating.
Yeah.
One other thing, with Mike Bloomberg still being, I think, a major force to be reckoned with just because of his money. A lot of people, it seems like especially there's been this push on the progressive left to say Mike Bloomberg, just his very existence is a problem for democracy. And there's that question at debate, should Mike Bloomberg even be allowed to exist? And Bloomberg's response is, wow, this is exactly the sort of question that Republicans love it when we talk about, because this is what's going to reelect. Yeah. I said, yeah, you're absolutely right, Mike Bloomberg. And when you think about what a Bloomberg presidency would look like, I mean, it would be a lot like the presidency of the other 3 moderates. Big focus on key liberal issues. Bloomberg has put a ton of money into guns, climate change, healthcare. I mean, he might be a little less eager to go after businesses than the others. But if you take a look at his recent tax plan, it called for a fee on every single financial transaction. And that would raise $5 trillion over 10 years. That's not exactly a centrist sort of thing, And one thing I really like about him is he is a technocrat. He's super smart. He's super analytical. I felt that about Barack Obama too, and in that sense, I get the sense that they're kind of kindred spirits. And so, but the fact that So what does buying an election even mean? I don't even buy that premise that Mike Bloomberg can buy. He can certainly buy a seat at the table as consideration, but I don't think he's going to buy anything if he doesn't have a message that resonates with people.
Yeah.
And to say that someone is buying the election is basically telling the voters, you're just a bunch of idiots, and he can manipulate you with his money. And I reject that as well. And I get why the other candidates are saying it, because they wish they had $1 billion to throw around. They don't, and so they have to say something, and so they're going to question, essentially, the wisdom and the intelligence of the electorate. And that's make no mistake, that's what they're doing.
Yeah, I wanted to make two quick points regarding Bloomberg, and then sort of I'll make a different point first. So one of the things that I noticed that was going on, and I talked about this the next day with a couple of different people, is the fact that everybody seemed to be trying to sort of go at the jugular and pick off the person who is just slightly above them in the polls. So it almost felt like if you kind of looked at these six people, Klobuchar was just nipping at Pete Buttigieg's heels. If she just really went after him, and it fell flat for her, I think.
Well,
but,
I think in part because it seemed like I felt like she was going to just throw up at any minute.
Yeah,
She seemed
she looked upset.
It was really not a good. I mean, when you talk about that sort of not so much likability, but it's hard to get behind somebody who seems like they're just nervous and desperate. That's not a good look.
Yeah. And then, conversely, you saw Elizabeth Warren going after Mike Bloomberg quite a bit, which, again, like gave her a little bit of boost in the polls. I think that'll probably temper, as this next week kind of transpires and the caucuses, everything sort of moves along in the shuffle of an election year. I think you'll see that die down. But there was this sort of like rallying cry for her to keep doing this, keep being more aggressive, because, I saw a headline that was something like "Nice Lizzie isn't here anymore. Now it's Mean Lizzie" or something. She seemed angry and upset, and she really picked on him about, like you said, buying this election. And I thought Bloomberg did his best to fight back, but he was just the not ready for prime time player. In that sense, he wasn't prepared for it. And then conversely, Joe Biden was just sort of on stage. It was hard to understand what his message was, who he was going after. Everybody at some point teamed up on Mike Bloomberg. A few times it was directed at Bernie. Then it was back and forth between Bernie and Bloomberg for a little while. So it just seemed like everybody, it was almost like a chaotic thing to watch, which I understand, because I remember I actually went physically to a Republican debate in 2016. And I thought the same thing. I'm like, oh, everybody's just attacking the person above them in the polls. Yeah. But, to this extent, the idea that Mike Bloomberg can come in and buy an election, I feel like it's a point that will, unfortunately, in our minds, we're thinking about policy and about, electability and things like that. And I would point to 2016 as a really good example of this. I mean, Clinton outspent Donald Trump like exponential amounts in terms of commercials and advertisements and everything else, and she didn't win. So it seems like every 4 years these numbers go up, but the idea that he's buying the election falls flat for some of us who kind of look at the greater historical perspective and say, well, every 4 years we spend more and more and more. Honestly, to most people, that will resonate. And they know that. People like Warren and Sanders, the people who support them know that. They don't like millionaires and billionaires. They're really out to get people like Mike Bloomberg. So that message of buying the election, although some of us, sat there cringing, I think it's safe to say that a lot of people were probably applauding that because it sounds good and it sounds right and it's exciting to them. And it's why people like Bernie Sanders get the support they do, because they say these things. Now, is it true? I don't know that it's true. Mike Bloomberg's outspent them all exponentially again, but every time I turn on the TV, I see 10 Mike Bloomberg ads. Of course, I'm in Florida, which is a hot state everybody wants to grab. But I agree with you on the idea of buying an election. I don't think that that's the case, and I think if I was a Democrat, I'd probably be a little offended too, if somebody were to say that to me. But that is something that would resonate with people.
Yeah,
so I want to point that out.
And one of our we had a number of questions about Bloomberg on our bipartisan politics Reddit group, and that was one kind of an issue that came up. Sabacon was one of the because it's always these Reddit names, but Sabacon is a big fan of the show and a big contributor on the group. Mentioned that same sort of thing about buying the election. We also had some other good comments or questions. One from our teacher who wrote in that his tendencies, this is Bloomberg, his tendencies toward racist mindsets, policies, and sexism and misogyny should be disqualifying for any candidacy, but especially one that strives to become the leader of the Democratic Party. And, that's obviously an issue that, you have to deal with, right? Because there are allegations out there. Now, the way that I think Elizabeth Warren took the low road and how she, there are some allegations, and I'll just mention these worst things and to treat this as if it's something that Mike Bloomberg said. And just like with Donald Trump, I feel like that, we should assume that these people are innocent until proven otherwise. Now, with Donald Trump, we had a tape of him saying things about women. And so Mike Bloomberg, we should investigate these things, but attacking without clear evidence is, I think, problematic. And so if that comes out, let's say that these women are, are released from, they asked to be released from their non-disclosure agreements, and they are, and they say, Mike Bloomberg said the thing like one of them's like, well, I do you, or something like that. Yeah, that is a wrong and reprehensible thing to say. But that is not the entirety of the person. So how do we weigh that in? Well, is that something that he still does? How much of a pattern is it? And Democrats had to deal with the same thing, obviously, with Bill Clinton in the 90s. And so it's the same thing that conservatives have to deal with Donald Trump. How much of his misogyny and awfulness does that weigh against what we feel he is going to do that's positive for the country? And so, of course, that's a consideration, but it's not the only consideration. And I disagree that it's disqualifying. Now, there are certain things that would be disqualifying. For instance, if a candidate had, recently used certain words, racial epithets and so forth to describe people, or certain words to describe women, like beginning with the C or something like that. Well, right away, I'd say, no, I'm sorry. I just can't accept that in a president. I don't care what other things that person brings to the table. But for some other cases, it is a factor to consider, but I don't think, at least it's not disqualifying for me. And I'm guessing you probably feel the same way because you've had to deal with that with President Trump.
And
certainly.
I had issues. In fact, one of the things, and I'll put this out there, one of the first things that I really latched onto, and I've said on the show back in 2015, 2016, he was my last choice Republican candidate. He was I didn't think he was electable. What he was saying just wasn't resonating with me. I preferred any other candidate. I was a Rand Paul supporter for a while. I was a Ted Cruz supporter for a while. I kind of jumped back and forth. And one of the things that I really latched onto was the fact that, he was mocking women's appearances, I should say. So he seemed to hone in on appearance, and he bashed Carly Fiorina on stage. And it's funny because I keep my personal Facebook page pretty light and airy, just for
That's
career
a good thing.
reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, if when I do debate issues, and I talk about politics, I do it in forums like this, and with friends, who I can actually get some feedback from. But on Facebook, it was one of the only times I ever really went off, and I was furious with the fact that he mocked her appearance, and I said so. I said so on Facebook. I'm not really on Twitter, but I think I might have even tweeted something, and I got a lot of blowback from that, actually, from people who supported Trump, and there were some people who considered it too. But I think that, overall, the process of my getting to voting for Trump was being able to look past that and realizing, well, it is about a bigger picture than that. I really don't like this. I don't stand for it. Is it enough to make me not vote for him in the end? Considering the whole picture, probably not. And I think people who we're already looking at Mike Bloomberg favorably, or can see, maybe, I mean, I don't think he would make a good president, obviously, but, there are people who might say, well, he might make a good president. He's better than Donald Trump. I'm willing to look past some of these
Yeah.
things without real proof of these things happening recently, which
Yeah.
is, to your point. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a bigger picture. When people get angry with me and they say, why are you voting for Donald Trump? And they bring up things like that. This is pretty much my argument, is that, I think you have to look at the totality
Yeah.
of the person, what they're trying to do and what they're trying to accomplish in your own ideals and your
Yeah.
vision for the future too. So, yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, I mean, for myself right now, I'm struggling with
Yeah.
that because I'm going to be voting on Super Tuesday like millions of other people,
Yeah, you
right?
are. Yes.
So,
Yes.
I mean, for me right now, it's there's a lot I like about what Mike Bloomberg is saying, but there are these other aspects that I think are legitimate, reasons for concern. And there's a lot, obviously, I like about. If I were just going by debate performances, it would be easy because Pete Buttigieg, I love the
I
guy.
know. He's a good debater too. I
He
mean, he
really
remains
is.
calm and collected. He is. He's like Barack Obama was the same way, right? There are
Yeah,
definitely some hints of Barack Obama there.
yeah. So and I that appeals to me like crazy. So
I know.
so I don't know. I will say this. I will let everyone know. Now, the ballot is secret, but I will let everyone know who I voted for on Super Tuesday and why. I imagine people will be at least a little bit curious. But honestly, I don't know. It's not going to be Joe Biden. Even though I said a couple weeks ago that I think he'll win the nomination.
I thought so too,
His
actually.
free fall is quicker than I even anticipated. We'll see
fast.
what happens in South Carolina, but
Yeah.
so I haven't decided yet, and I'm still doing some heavy duty mulling. But we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that after Super Tuesday. So I know we're kind of out of time today, but we still have so much to cover. Kristen, we didn't get a chance to talk about, for instance, a contested convention, and I know we have a lot to say about that.
Yeah, I had so many notes written down. I was so excited to talk about it.
Not only that, but there's that whole issue of, this last week, right? Donald Trump named yet another acting agency head. And I think that's just a huge issue that we really want to dig deep into. And the good news is we are going to do that on the midweek supporters only show. So if you are a Patreon supporter, you're going to get that. And if not, hey, it's real simple to do that. Just go to patreon.com/politicsguys and sign right up. And again, if you can't afford that $5 a month, we get it. So just email me at mike@politicsguys.com and I will make sure you get that midweek episode. And also, we really do appreciate if you could subscribe to the show, leave ratings, reviews. That really helps us out a lot. That would be great. And of course, sharing your favorite episodes on social media or email. You already know how to get in touch with us, mail@politicsguys.com. And I keep on mentioning our bipartisan politics subreddit because I just like it so much. And the link's in the show notes. You can also just go to Reddit and search for bipartisan politics. We also have a Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys page. And we are, of course, on Twitter, and that's @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, and Daniel Toe. Today's show is produced by us, Mike Baranowski and Kristen Matheny. We will be back with a new show next week. We hope you'll join us.